On Christmas Eve, William exchanged a Facebook message with a friend where he spoke of brutally killing Mrs. McGuire and spending the rest of his life in jail so he didn't have to worry about life or money. He wasn't taken seriously. He also started contacting friends offering to kill McGuire for a tenner. Then his Facebook profile picture changed. Instead of his image, there was now an image of the Grim Reaper, a harsh reflection of what was to come. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Episode 46, Ann McGuire. Ann McGuire was a brilliant teacher. She started her career as a Spanish teacher at Corpus Christi Catholic College at the age of 21 in 1974. She never left and enjoyed her teaching there for 40 years. During that time, she had met the love of her life, Donald, and they had been happily married for 37 years. They'd been blessed with 2 wonderful and successful daughters who had benefited from the love and care of their parents as they had grown into adulthood. Both parents were thrilled when one of their daughters graduated into the Royal Ballet Company, an internationally renowned classical ballet company based at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, London, and recognised as Britain's flagship ballet company. More was to come though, as their daughter was promoted to first artist in 2007 and soloist in 2011. As she brought up her daughters, Anne continued to teach at Corpus Christi Catholic College, an 11 to 16 age mixed comprehensive, now an academy, situated just 3 miles east of Leeds city centre. The college is a little different to some other schools in that it actively promotes gospel values and the teachings of the Catholic Church that underpin all aspects of college life. The college describes itself as seeking to, quote, support and challenge our students as they grow into adulthood, knowing it is important for them to do their best, care for those around them and bear witness to Christ in the modern world, end quote. Today, the school retains traditional values and has a strong reputation in the east of Leeds, providing what it describes as a strong Christian ethos, a broad and balanced curriculum, high expectations with regards to uniform and behaviour, and outstanding pastoral care. Its strong Christian ethos is reflected every day through prayer, which is central to the life of the school, and something that Anne would experience daily. The school's mission was work, learn, pray, grow. This ethos suited Anne, who could fulfill one of her primary personal principles of growth through learning by helping the students at the college to achieve their full potential. For those who were gifted, Anne would expect them to use the gift they'd been given to the fullest. Not to do so, in her opinion, was a waste of their talent and against her principles. It was this focus, this enthusiasm, this belief that learning could change lives that made Anne such a great teacher. She was described as instinctive, intuitive, very hands-on and a leader. Her work was always carried out with a generous smile and giving nature. This was matched by a marvellous ability to inspire and enthuse. Pupils knew the high standards expected of them, and Anne appealed to their higher nature. As time went by, Anne grew to know generations of families who had been at the school. She made a point of always making a student proud of their school, their family, and themselves. And through this, she was able to put in place for each and every one of them the elements that helped them to be motivated to achieve the best they could. She gave each of her pupils the safety, security, and care that provided the perfect learning environment. And after they had left, many would actually return for a visit to the school and to have a chat with Mrs. McGuire, the teacher who had such a positive influence on them. She was dedicated and gave far more of herself to the school and the students than could ever have been expected. She was tenacious, and if there was a problem, she wouldn't rest until it was sorted out and was prepared to stay late after school and get on the phone to parents and carers. And it worked. Her Spanish students regularly attained 1 or 2 grades higher than in any other subject. She was quickly appointed head of Year Group 11, the critical final year of school, because she was known for her competence and capability. Her students, in their own words, described her as, quote, really caring. She sort of couldn't do enough for people. She was just really lovely to everybody, and they said that she genuinely wanted to see her students succeed. One said, quote, "What I remember most about her was her determination to get the best from us, to put into our heads what we needed to get through, to get by. That caring, that intensity, could at times spill over into fierceness, goaded by some jackass, or when she came across bullying or unkindness in others. But it isn't the fierceness that I remember when I think of her. I think of her face, always on the verge of a smile, her consideration, the way she listened when you spoke to her." Way back in the 1970s, when Anne had just started at the school, she taught a young student who went on to become a playwright. He was in the bottom classes with what he describes as difficult to educate kids. He said, quote, "It was a very, very tough environment. There was lots of bullying and a general feeling of oppression and danger in my first year. He felt lucky to have Anne as his form teacher because, quote, she was full of life and vivacity and energy. She was very important in my life because I had this difficult start. And she was a genuinely brilliant teacher. She had this fun, this energy, and would engage with you as well. She would look at you when you were speaking, listen to you and respond to what you were saying, which was slightly unusual. But also she was a deadly serious educator. She was really determined to pass on that baton of learning to other people. And she was a strict teacher. You didn't mess about in her lessons because she was doing something important. She didn't want the more disruptive kids to ruin it for the other kids who she was trying to help. Although Anne couldn't read music, she had a great love and a great ear for it, and had responsibility for the Corpus Christi choir who sang magnificently at awards evenings and school events. Anne was a master of enabling the choir to create beautiful harmonies and creative sounds from the generations of students who came to sing with her. By the year 2014, though, the time had come for Anne to rest from her active and productive teaching role, and she was due to retire in a few months' time. Little did Anne know, just under 16 years before she decided to retire, William Cornick was born, a boy who would change her life forever. William Cornick was born on the 26th of June 1998. Even though his parents split up 5 years after his birth, they were both concerned about the effect their separation might have on him, and so always ensured that he had the foundation of a supportive and loving environment around him. To begin with, William was a quiet child and he kept himself to himself. As he grew older, his interest in the armed forces developed until he had decided that what he would like to do when he left school was to join the army. He became fixated on this and actually found it hard to think about anything else. His days would revolve around researching what it would take to join the army. This was until he and his family went on holiday when he was just 12 years old. They'd gone on a family holiday to Cornwall, and William had taken a fall. It's not uncommon for a 12-year-old child running around on holiday to fall over, but this was different. He had seemingly fallen over nothing, out of nowhere. Doctors conducted tests, and it was quickly discovered that William had diabetes. Even at the young age of 12, he knew what this meant, and that was that he was unlikely to be able to pass the army medical, and so his dream of joining the army was shattered. William found it difficult to deal with this news, and so, for a brief period after he found this out, he began self-harming. As time went by, he seemed to forget his disappointment and concentrated on his studies at Corpus Christi College. William had a lot of potential. He was a hard worker. He had a perfect attendance record in his 4.5 years at the school so far. He was clever, very clever, with a level of intelligence that set him apart from his peers and led to him being described as academically gifted. Because of this, he took 5 GCSEs a year early and passed them all. Although in his younger years he liked to keep himself to himself, he was also a perfectly friendly child and teenager who had his fair share of friends at school and would often spend some time with them enjoying a game of cards at break. His school behaviour was normal, no better and certainly no worse than any other of the students in his year. He had 5 incidents of misbehaviour recorded, which was at the lower end of the scale for pupils of his age, and he was not considered by anyone to be disruptive. His classmates said he was unlikely ever to cause trouble. He was just a normal, everyday schoolchild, apart from his above-average level of intelligence. By now, at the age of 15, he had grown strong and tall and stood at over 6 feet in height. He was a lot taller than his 5'2" Spanish teacher, Ann McGuire. He had all the size and strength of a fit and healthy 15-year-old youth. At Corpus Christi College, Ann knew William well and had taught him regularly. She knew of his academic ability and that he would be able to achieve a lot if he continued to show his past work ethic, and she considered that he had a very bright future ahead of him. But by 2013, Ann thought William was easing off of his schoolwork, that he had stopped pushing himself as he used to, and that he was taking less interest in lessons and was starting to fail to hand in homework. To Ann, with her love of learning and teaching, this must have seemed a shame and almost a betrayal of the talent and ability that he had. So, Ann started pushing him, encouraging him to concentrate, asking him to work harder, pushing him in a mild way if he failed to hand in homework or meet deadlines. William resented this. He had grown into a confused teenager who was disorientated about what he believed, what he wanted from life, and how he was going to get it. In many ways, he was going through the normal growing up process. What wasn't so normal was the grudge he held against Ann McGuire, the teacher who was trying to help him stay focused through this challenging period of life. Then things started to get out of hand. On Christmas Eve, William exchanged a Facebook message with a friend where he spoke of brutally killing Mrs. McGuire and spending the rest of his life in jail so he didn't have to worry about life or money. Not that he was taken seriously. He had also started contacting friends offering to kill McGuire for a tenner. Then his Facebook profile picture changed. Instead of his image, there was now an image of the Grim Reaper. Things deteriorated further in February 2014. Once again, William was in trouble, and this time, Ann felt she had to make sure he realised there were consequences to his behaviour. She thought that if he didn't take notice now, William may really come off of the rails with his studies and throw away chances of achieving his true capability. He had been booked to go on a school bowling trip, but after he failed to complete the homework he had been set, Ann banned him from going. Whilst William didn't take any notice of Ann and went on the school trip anyway, he was furious at being humiliated in front of his friends, and for that, he could not forgive Ann. Shortly after he'd ignored Ann's instructions not to go on the school trip, he was called into a meeting at the school. There, he was informed he'd be placed on internal exclusion because of his disrespect and rudeness, particularly towards Ann. Shortly after the meeting on the 25th of February 2014, William sent a message to a friend on Facebook. Quote, "The one absolute fucking bitch that deserves more than death, more than pain, torture, and more than anything that we can understand." As William's behaviour deteriorated at school, he started listening to the Pulp Fiction soundtrack Jungle Boogie in class. His Facebook posts became even more extreme, as did his comments to his classmates when he saw them face to face. Quote, "Let's break into school, smash everything in Spanish, then get drunk, do it again and punch some walls." End quote. Although he did suggest this, it never happened. Instead of offering to kill Ann for a tenner, he now offered to give a tenner to other students willing to carry out this barbaric fantasy. Ann became more determined to get him back on track, and she gave him a detention. He told Ann he wanted to give up Spanish, presumably so that he could escape her attention and encouragement. She told him that he couldn't drop Spanish. Then he came up with a date and day for his plan to kill Ann. He posted, "If I do it on Tuesday, will you bail me out?" Tuesday arrived. It was the 28th of April 2014. William got up as usual to get ready for school, but today was not a usual day. He went into the kitchen and took 2 kitchen knives, including one with a 21cm long blade, out of the drawer. He put the knives in his rucksack together with a bottle of Jack Daniels, which he had brought to celebrate. He then made his way to school. As William walked into school, everything seemed normal. He went to his normal lessons, chatted to his friends, and grabbed a drink from the machine. But things weren't normal. During the break, William showed his fellow pupils the weapons he had brought to school for the murder. He bragged in front of at least 10 other classmates about his plan. It wasn't only Anne he was going to murder, he told them. He had a particular dislike for the head of Year 11. He was going to take him out as well. And one other teacher was pregnant. He was going to stab the pregnant teacher, he said, in the stomach to kill her unborn child. After morning break, just after 11:30 a.m, it was time for William to go to his Spanish lesson with Ann McGuire in the 4th floor languages suite, classroom T51. He walked up the stairs to the top floor, into the classroom, and sat down at his desk. The other students for the lesson were either already sitting down and waiting, or were hurriedly arriving, sitting down in their usual places and getting their books out ready to be taught. Anne turned round to face the class and welcome them all. She then started the lesson, which proceeded as normal, Anne speaking in Spanish unless she had a particularly complicated concept to explain, where she then might break into English, using the whiteboards for the students and setting the class exercises so they could practice what had been taught. Then, William and some of the other students went to room T50 next door so they could work in quieter surroundings. Instead of getting on with his work, though, William got out the larger of the 2 knives and showed it to one of the others in the room. Then he practiced where to conceal it, ready for the attack. Halfway through the lesson, William stood up, winked at the student he'd shown the knife to, and began to walk back to room T51, the classroom where Anne was at her desk, bent over looking at students' written work and helping them to make sense of the exercise. Anne wasn't aware of William walking quietly towards her back, but other students in the room who could see what he was doing couldn't understand it. Why was he walking up to Ann McGuire in the middle of the lesson? Why had he come back into room T51 from T50? At this stage, the knife was still hidden in William's clothing. The 6-foot-tall, strong 15-year-old teenager came up behind 5-foot-2-inch-tall Anne, who appeared even smaller as she bent over looking at the student's work at her desk. William was now within an arm's length of her. She still wasn't aware of his presence behind her. Then, he reached for the larger of the 2 knives, the one with the 21cm blade that he had brought with him from home and was concealed underneath his clothes. Before anyone in the room could scream a warning or shout towards Anne, William brought the knife down 7 times in her back and neck, one of the blows cutting straight through her jugular vein. Some of the students in the room gasped or screamed. Others just tried to get out of the room. They didn't know what William would do next. They were in shock, scared, traumatized at what they had just seen, something they would never be able to forget. Meanwhile, Anne was still conscious and ran out of the room into the corridor. Another teacher, Susan, heard the commotion and came out of her classroom to be confronted by a group of students running the other way along the corridor trying to get away from William and the scene of the stabbing. Anne was holding the back of her neck and said, "He stabbed me in the neck." William wanted to make sure she would die, and he had actually followed her with the intention of inflicting more damage on her already frail body. Susan grabbed Anne and pushed her into a workroom, and then held the door shut with her foot. She could see William through the glass door walking towards them, calmly, getting closer and closer with every step, and she had no idea what he would do next. In reality, if he decided that he wanted to kick the door in or break the glass to get the 2 women, he would be quite capable of doing that. As William got closer and closer, his face was emotionless. He was like a zombie. He reached the door. He looked straight at the 2 teachers, one at the door with her foot against it, and the other now collapsed on the floor, bleeding slowly to death. William then calmly turned around and walked back to the class, where he sat down next to his classmate as though nothing had happened. He then turned towards his horrified classmate and said, quote, "good times," and that it was a shame that he had not killed Ann McGuire. Ann lay on the floor bleeding heavily, staff frantically trying to stop the bleeding until paramedics arrived. Susan comforted her, but was only too aware that she was probably dying, so she spoke to her about her children and the fact that she was loved. The experienced paramedics arrived quickly and started to move Ann towards the ambulance, but on the way, Ann stopped breathing. Despite this, the crew managed to keep Ann alive until she reached hospital and could be treated properly. One of the crew described Ann's wounds as the worst stab wounds I have ever seen. Ann's loving husband was called and made the frantic trip to hospital to be by her side. Meanwhile, 2 members of staff bravely confronted William as they waited for the police. William held up his arms in surrender and was grabbed to be led away. William said to them, quote, "Can you be careful? My knuckle hurts and my hand is bleeding." But other than that, William seemed to be unaware of the seriousness of what he had done, as he chatted to those around him with a strange calmness and air of normality. Ann never regained consciousness and died of her wounds with her husband beside her. She was pronounced dead at Leeds General Infirmary at 1:10 in the afternoon, about 2 hours after she had been attacked. The police arrived and immediately arrested William. The arresting officers were struck by how calm he was. There was no doubt about what he had done. No detailed or lengthy investigation would be needed to identify the perpetrator and his actions. They had been witnessed, and William wasn't denying them. There were, however, questions that needed to be answered about why he had done this. Whilst the police would explore these, it would take the right questions about William's psychological state to get the answers from someone like a forensic psychologist. William appeared in court, charged with murder, and was immediately remanded in custody to go on trial on the 3rd of November at Leeds Crown Court. He was initially detained at Wetherby Young Offenders Institution near Leeds, but due to concerns for his safety, he was transferred to HM Prison Hindley near Wigan. At Corpus Christi College, those who went to or worked at the school, friends of Ann, and the local community left flowers and messages pinned to the fences outside the school gates, and these stretched for more than 100 metres. Many of the messages were from current and former pupils, but others were from strangers who wanted to register their sadness. Ann McGuire's murder sent a shockwave beyond the UK and provoked a huge response in terms of tributes from and around the world. Even the Pope sent a message of condolence, as did the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, and Frances Lawrence, widow of London head teacher Philip Lawrence, who was murdered in 1995. News channels were full of reports about the murder, and questions were asked at parliamentary level about knife crime and knives in the possession of school students. The country stood together in misbelief that something like this could ever have happened. Ann's funeral took place on the 16th of May at the Church of the Immaculate Heart of Mary next door to the school, and around 300 people attended. Ann's husband, Don, arrived with the family's 2 daughters and 2 nephews, who Ann had treated as her own sons after the death of her sister. In his eulogy, Don spoke of his late wife's dedication to her students. Quote, "Ann loved teaching. For Ann, teaching was a dream as a very young child, an ambition in teenage years, a fulfilling reality for 40 years. Spanish was her subject. The pace and rhythm of modern language teaching suited her so well. Being head of 5th form, a great passion, because that is where the range of her personal qualities and abilities was fully exercised. But, in true humility, she always stressed that she learned so much from others. She was a beautiful, vivacious, caring, generous human being." Separately, her daughters and nephew said, quote, "We look forward to the future with a fragile hope." They praised Ann as a generous spirit who led by example, always putting others first, especially young people. As well as a funeral, A memorial service was planned for the 29th of September. Before that memorial service, her widower Don, aged 62, told the BBC he hoped it would reflect the beautiful, dedicated, hard-working woman she was. He said, "I would hope that the memorial service would reflect Anne's life and help people connect to her life. She was a very special individual. She did the everyday things in a very special way." And in the same interview, one of her daughters said, "We really want Mum's legacy to be something that stands for everything she was." She taught for 40 years and will have affected thousands of people's lives and probably shaped the career choices and decisions they made in their lives, or even the people they became. 1,200 people packed into Leeds Town Hall for the memorial service, and another 500 gathered in front of a big screen outside. Many things were spoken about that day, including Anne's compassion and commitment to teaching. Quote, "Following the tragedy of her untimely death, we mark her wonderful contribution to education in our city. We unite in sharing one purpose, to honour and celebrate Anne's life and work." Anne loved teaching. It was her dream as a very young child, her ambition as a teenager, a fulfilling reality for 40 years. Anne believed in the innate goodness of children and young people. Anne rightly lived up to the accolade of mother of the school. Her nephews shared their childhood memories in a letter written to their aunt and said that they were privileged to have had her in their lives. The brothers said, quote, "We hope you realise, Anne, that all you did has been remembered and appreciated. We're here today to say we miss you. We're here today to say we love you, but we really, really would like to say thank you. Good night. God bless." In a compilation of tributes made by the pupils at Corpus Christi, they were asked to use one word to describe Anne. The words they used were perfect, passionate, fantastic, amazing, and warm. As the events unfolded in William's trial, investigators continued to probe both into the circumstances surrounding the murder and into William's psychological state. The police found multiple images of different types of knives on William's phone. He had also done a lot of research into the most effective way to murder someone. A post-mortem was held and discovered that Anne had been stabbed 7 times to the upper back and neck. One stab caused the knife to pass all the way through the lower neck, and another severed her jugular vein. Her ribs had been shattered by the knife stab, and one of those penetrated her right lung. All of the wounds were inflicted from behind, and the pathologist concluded that many were inflicted with severe force. She stood no chance. In preparation for his trial and sentencing, William had a series of interviews with forensic psychiatrists and adolescent clinical psychologists. The question was, were there any mitigating circumstances for his actions? William told the experts, quote, "On the Thursday before, I'd decided homicide rather than suicide. I don't know why. I'd had homicidal thoughts since February. Be done with it. At the time I did it, I wasn't thinking about it, it was a plan. I just knew I was going to kill her. On the Sunday, I thought I was going to get my other weapon. I'd considered a blunt object, for example a stick, but this would be hard to hide and hard to do. I considered a gun, but I couldn't get one, and I didn't know where to start. I'd considered gravity. I thought about breaking a window and pushing her out, but I couldn't break the window. I decided on the Sunday that it was going to be a knife. I thought I was just going to go to school and wait for her lesson and do it. I wanted to get caught. That's why I did it in school. I wanted to be in jail." Unquote. He said that there was no future for him after diabetes destroyed any chance that he had of joining the army. Quote, "The killing was always on my mind since year 8. The thought of homicide, murdering her. I was always telling my friends the bitch was terrible." End quote. It was concluded that William generally experienced 7 strong feelings of anger, but there was little sign of that in his outward appearance. He had a very high disposition to experience anger without specific provocation, and his ability to manage his angry thoughts constructively was limited. William's anger was premeditated and predatory, And one of the dangerous aspects of his personality was that his outward appearance did not disclose his anger. Quote, "The defendant's actions leading up to the killing were pre-planned, goal-directed, and in full knowledge that they were wrong. William was at least of average intelligence, and there was no evidence of any thought disorder, psychotic, or other major psychiatric illness. He was diagnosed with an adjustment disorder with psychopathic tendencies at a time when he should have been developing and maturing into an independent person. Adjustment disorder can be defined as a mental health condition that develops as a result of the person having to adjust to a particularly stressful life event, creating an excessively negative response. In William, it was suggested that this was combined with psychopathic tendencies that may manifest as persistent antisocial behaviour, impaired empathy and remorse, and bold, disinhibited and egotistical traits. The experts went on to identify that William had a gross lack of empathy for his victim and a degree of callousness rarely seen in clinical practice. There was evidence of personality disorder with some 8 marked psychopathic traits with a preoccupation with homicide. William's psychiatrists said, quote, "The risk is of grave homicidal violence, and this could easily involve the use of a weapon. The risk is immediate and unpredictable and could cause serious and lethal injury." End quote. William presented a risk of serious harm to the public, and the risk was immediate and unpredictable and could cause serious and lethal injury, and the possibility that the teen would kill again could not be excluded. These reports were available to the court when William was brought to trial at Leeds Crown Court on the 3rd of November. As William sat through the trial, he remained calm and emotionless. Occasionally, he would shuffle in his seat, staring blankly at the floor. He seemed almost disinterested in the proceedings that would ultimately determine his future. Prosecutor Greene addressed the question of why, if William had made no secret of his plans for murder from those around him, he was not reported. Many of the pupils at school knew what he was claiming he would do. Why didn't they raise the alarm at the time that William had told them? Probably most didn't believe him and thought they were listening to the fantasized rantings of an immature teenage boy. What we do know, though, is that others weren't so sure and did want to report it. But William had threatened them. He told them that if they ever said a word, they would suffer the same fate as Ann McGuire. Prosecutor Greene told Leeds Crown Court. Indeed, when he showed some a knife and was told by them to calm down, he said he would fucking kill them if they revealed his plan. The prosecutor said that there was nothing to indicate that William's parents or teachers that there was a risk of homicidal violence with him. Quote, "The parents are decent people and responsible parents. They are at a loss to understand how and why their son has turned out as he has, and they have cooperated fully with the police and with the prosecution." End quote. The court heard that behind his apparent quiet, intelligent persona, William, who had received generally positive academic reports, harboured an irrational hatred for Anne and took pride in her killing. But not only Anne. William had a list of those on whom he wanted revenge. It was rumoured that there were all sorts of things going around school about what he was planning and the things he wanted to do in connection with that day, and that he had a list of people he wanted payback on, teachers and students. If he hadn't killed Anne, then he would have killed others at some point. In mitigation, his defence barrister told the court, quote, "Plainly, these were the actions of a deeply disturbed young man." On the 3rd of November 2014, William Cornick was sentenced for the murder of Ann McGuire. Unusually, Judge Mr. Justice Colson sentencing remarks focused on the victim. This is an edited version of those remarks, first about Ann McGuire, and then he gives his explanation for the sentence he imposed on William. Ann McGuire was such a remarkable person that it's only right I start these observations by focusing on her personally and her achievements. She was genuinely loved by her pupils. The court has seen today some of the interviews with those children who had seen her murdered. Notwithstanding the appalling events that they had recently witnessed, many of them wanted to say something about how wonderful Ann McGuire was, both as a teacher and as a person. Just by way of example, we heard one pupil describe her as really caring. She sort of couldn't do enough for the people, she was really just lovely to everybody. Another pupil described her as more of a friend than a teacher. And another, when asked what she was like, said she was wonderful. She was just so nice to everyone, she was kind. She'd always stay back late. Her main goal for everyone in that class, she just wanted them to come on top and achieve what she knew they could achieve. You could tell that she loved doing what she was doing every day. Similar views were expressed by her teaching colleagues. Susan Francis, the head of languages at the school and the woman who had bravely intervened during the attack, described her as both wonderful and fantastic. Another 2 teachers at the school, who in other circumstances might have been an additional victim of the defendant, described Ann McGuire as an amazing woman and teacher. Numerous people have spoken out about how much she loved her job and how much, in return, her pupils loved her. Her family have given moving evidence of her numerous qualities. Her brother-in-law Brian described her as a shining light. Quote, "She trod her own path and lit up our lives in so many different ways. She was a joy to be with." Another brother-in-law described her shining, fun, bright personality, which drew people to her, and when you were in her company, you always felt you were the most important person in her world. Her sister Denise said that Anne was not just her big sister, but was, quote, "my carer, my protector, my teacher, my confidant, my role model, the person who inspired me most, and in the last 20 years, she became my best friend in life." Anne was genuinely one of life's beautiful, selfless, extraordinary, kind people. She radiated happiness, joy, and positivity. Her smile lit up the room, and people wanted to be around her. They were attracted to her energy and zest for life. And of course, she had 2 daughters, and they lost their mother. One of her daughters, Emma, said, quote, "She was a wonderful mother. She gave us so much love. I never felt alone in life. She felt every up and down with me, and perhaps more acutely. She was stronger than all of us put together and carried us through many of life's challenges. She was an extraordinary person." The judge went on to say that William developed an irrational and all-consuming hatred of the person that he planned to kill in such a cowardly way. His parents were responsible and caring, and his family life was marked by love and support. His feelings of anger, mainly directed at Ann McGuire, were completely irrational. There can be no doubt that the defendant is highly dangerous. His complete lack of remorse, which is a significant feature of all of the psychiatric and psychological evidence. The judge then told William, "The sentence for murder is automatic. Given your age, it is detention during Her Majesty's pleasure. That is an indeterminate sentence. It is, to all intents and purposes, a life sentence. The only remaining matter for me is to fix the minimum term that you will serve. I should make quite clear that this means what it says. You will only be released thereafter once the parole board decides that you no longer pose a danger to the public." Given the psychiatric and psychological reports that I've read, it's quite possible that that day will never come. The starting point for the minimum term for anyone under 18 convicted of murder is 12 years. Having adopted that as my starting point, as I am obliged to do, I then turn to the aggravating and mitigating factors. In my view, there are 7 significant aggravating factors. First, there is your extensive premeditation and planning. You decided to kill Ann McGuire months before you did so, and you openly fantasized about it. The plan to kill her was formulated before the act itself, and included a consideration of possible weapons and methods. You eventually decided, some days before the event, that you would stab her to death at your school. You took 2 knives with you just in case. In every respect, this was a long way from a killing on the spur of the moment. Secondly, you took a knife to the classroom with the express purpose of killing Mrs. McGuire. If you were 18, that would give rise to a starting point for the minimum term of 25 years. Thirdly, Mrs. McGuire plainly suffered before she died. Death was not instantaneous, and the severity of the stab wounds demonstrates the pain that she would have suffered before she died. Moreover, It is plain that both she and Susan Francis knew she was dying as she lay in the workroom. Fourthly, Mrs. McGuire was a teacher, teaching a GCSE Spanish class at a well-known and well-respected Leeds school. She was therefore fulfilling a public duty. Teachers play a critical role in our society and are in an important position of authority. They are entitled to proper protection and to expect that those who injure or kill their colleagues are dealt with severely by the courts. Fifthly, this was a killing which you deliberately chose to commit in public. You killed Mrs. McGuire in front of a classroom of horrified 15 and 16-year-olds. The damage done to them is incalculable. Many may be traumatised forever by what they saw. Your complete lack of empathy for them, your callous disregard for your classmates is perhaps the worst single element in this catalogue of aggravating factors. Sixthly, the level of violence was savage and cowardly. It was an attack on a petite woman in her 60s by a strapping teenager armed with a large knife. It was carried out from behind. It was a sustained attack because even when Mrs. McGuire got away from you, you followed her and continued to stab her. Finally, you have shown a total and chilling lack of remorse. At one stage, you described Mrs. McGuire as barely human. In my view, these remarks, your pride in what you did and your complete lack of remorse, are truly grotesque, and are further significant aggravating factors which I must reflect in the sentence. In my view, these aggravating factors more than double the statutory starting point of 12 years, and prior to any consideration of the mitigating factors, would lead to a minimum term of 25 years. As William was led to the cells, Anne's family, who sat just feet away, embraced. William's father could not bear to look at him as he was led away to the cells. In January 2015, William appealed against his 20-year minimum term, and this was heard at the Court of Appeal in London. After hearing the submission from William's legal team, the panel of 3 judges entirely rejected William's appeal. They said the sentencing judge came to entirely the right decision. William will remain in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. Following Anne's death, her family set up the Ann McGuire Arts Education Fund. Anne loved the performing arts as a way of helping children to fully express their potential. Her nephew said that music was a direct link to Anne's soul. The aim of the Educational Trust is to provide bursaries and funding for the enhancement and personal development of young people under 18 years old through music, drama, language, and dance. Ann McGuire's death was the first killing of a teacher in a British classroom.